Hi, I'm Frank Price, and I've spent my professional career in the television motion picture business, starting in 1951 at CBS, where I was fortunate to get a job there because I was a very good typist, and when I happened to drop into the story department, television story department at CBS, and I said to the young lady sitting at a reception desk, tell me, how do you get a job here? She said, I'm leaving, would you be interested in mine? And I said, sure. So she sent me over to personnel. They gave me a typing test. I happened to have taken typing in junior high school and had typed intelligence documents when I was in the Navy, so I was a very good typist. So I owe most of my career to the fact that I was a good typist. So I got that job, and I served as the receptionist, clerk typist, but then I found that the story department had like 8 readers, and you could get paid for reading all day and writing little reports. And I thought, that's a wonderful job. So I like to read, so I became one of the readers. Then I became a story editor. Then I started writing. So that writing led to my becoming a producer in television, ultimately, with some very bad shows. I think initially I worked on a thing at Ziv called Rough Riders, which was one of the worst shows I've ever seen, and but I got enough experience, so I became the executive producer finally of a new show called The Virginian. That was a big hit. I had written the format for it, and I ignored the movies that had been made. I went back to the book written by Owen Wister, which in that book, he created the Western as it's known, because every story, every situation you might deal with in a Western, Owen Wister touched on. And that the Knight of the Plains, the cowboy as Knight of the Plains, didn't exist before Owen Wister, who'd gone to Harvard and was a friend of Teddy Roosevelt. So they both loved the West. So anyway, The Virginian was a big hit. And then I produced series like Ironside and It Takes a Thief. Then I became head of Universal Television, where I managed to get a number of hits that would vary from, say, The $6 Million Man and A Bionic Woman to Rockford Files and Quincy and Battlestar Galactica and there was Baba Black Sheep with Bob Conrad.
That's a great show. I love that show.
So we had a lot of shows, and also during the time at Universal, I produced one of the first movies ever made for television. Nobody thought an audience would look at movies that were directly made for television. They all thought you had to exhibit in theaters first, but I did one called The Doomsday Flight. It got nearly a 50 share, and it established the fact that people would watch them. There didn't seem to be any question of that. So, and then the novel for television form, I was very responsible for bringing that in, because it was really Rich Man, Poor Man, which I'd spent a long time developing with a favorite writer of mine, Dean Reisner, and I wanted one writer to do all episodes so that there was a consistency. One of the things I really enjoyed about doing Rich Man, Poor Man was I got to spend time with Irwin Shaw, who was a writer I had admired as a teenager. So one of the perks of the job. So Then I felt I had done all I really could do in television, that I was going to be repeating myself, so I wanted to do motion pictures. So there was a big scandal at Columbia Pictures, and they needed somebody to come in, and I managed to get out of my Universal contract, went to Columbia and headed Columbia Pictures, and there I had a good run.
Now, where was Columbia when you did it? MGM or old MGM or what, behind Warner?
Columbia shared the Burbank Studios lot. It was the old Warner Brothers lot, which Columbia had. I worked at Columbia when I first came out here as a reader, story editor, and it was located at Gower and Sunset in Hollywood.
Oh, wow.
And then, as Columbia experienced hard times, they wanted to save money on overhead, so they made a deal to share half of Warner Brothers lot. All the studios were trying to save money, and they sold the old Columbia lot, which was a terrible mistake. What happened was that they miscalculated because Columbia's overhead, Columbia had been of the majors, it and Universal were the minors. MGM, Fox, Warner Brothers, Paramount, those were the big studios, and the small majors were Columbia and Universal. So when Columbia, without doing the numbers, made the deal and moved in with Warner Brothers, what they found was that the overhead that they shared with Warner Brothers was higher than the overhead they were paying when they were an independent studio, because Harry Cohn had managed to keep Columbia's overhead minimal. But Warner Brothers had huge departments, so the electrical department, every department you could go through was there was much more staffing involved in it. So, but anyway, when I went into Columbia, it was in trouble. Lou Wasserman had said to me when I was trying to persuade him to let me out of my contract, he said, "Frank, why would you go to Columbia? They may not be in business 6 months from now, whereas here, you're one of the 3 guys that will inherit this studio." And I said to him very honestly, I said, "Lou, I don't want to look in the mirror when I'm 65 and say, gee, I wish I'd done that. And I want to run a motion picture studio. So, and I want to make motion pictures." They had offered me a deal as a producer on the Universal lot to do motion pictures, but I knew what would happen at that point. I'd start producing television shows. I'd go to my strength. And what I had to do was be plunged in the middle of a motion picture operation, with that being my sole responsibility, and then I knew I would either make or break it. So as it turned out, I went into Columbia. Stock was in terrible shape. It was selling at $3 and $4 a share.
Good time to buy now.
And I was operating on short budgets. I couldn't commit money more than 6 months out. We didn't have money. I was trying to figure out how to get the money to make anything. So, but I did figure that all out. I made some very low budget pictures like Blue Lagoon, which became a big hit. Karate Kid was in the category of, I was always looking for how do we make something for little money that can have a big upside. So, and those are dangerous pictures for anybody in charge, because if you've got a picture with a named director and named stars and that, if it fails, there are a lot of people to blame. Whereas if you make something like Blue Lagoon, which everybody thought was a crazy idea, I think it was called Frank's Folly, If it
Randall
fails,
Kleiser. Great film.
if it fails, you look like a real idiot. There's nobody else at fault. It's all your fault. You were the dumb one that did that. So anyway, fortunately, Blue Lagoon was a very big hit. So, but I also benefited from my experience at Universal and working with Lou Wasserman, and we had our arrangements with NBC, and so one of the things I pushed for was an arrangement with HBO for them to make a deal with us to buy our entire output. And we made an HBO deal. I then arranged for another deal, which was with RCA, because a friend of mine, Herb Schlosser, was important at RCA. And so we made a domestic deal where we partnered with them on video cassettes,
That was the big
rental.
deal, yeah.
And we got $100 million for the domestic deal and a partnership with them. And on the international deal, again with RCA, we got $100 million and the partnership. So, and we also put in a clause that we could get out of the deal in 10 years. So if circumstances change, nobody had a real good idea on what the future of the business was. Was it going to be those videotapes? Was it going to be discs? Was it a rental business? Was it a sale business? It was all, we thought we needed a record company to partner with, which is why we chose RCA. Ultimately, we didn't really need them, but we did have the $200 million and that, so it gave us the money to do pictures like Tootsie, and I was able to make the deal to get Gandhi, and
So Gandhi started in Colombia?
Gandhi was Colombia.
Colombia, great.
Yeah, and I didn't have too much competition getting it because what I was told at the time.
Nobody wanted it, right?
It's possible that Paramount might have, but we definitely wanted it. I wanted it and pursued it, and but what I think the common wisdom in town was saying that nobody under 40 knew who Gandhi was. He'd totally forgotten. So, and I think the other line was, who would want to see a picture about a little brown man wandering around in a diaper? So, but we were bold on it. We'd seen some of the footage because Dickie Attenborough had worked out shooting in India, and one very good thing they'd worked out was that rupees could be taken out of, you could take your money out on that picture. Generally, you do anything in India as a motion picture, distribute whatever, the rupees had to stay there. That's why all motion picture companies would fly their prints around the world on Air India, because you had to find some way to use the rupees that just kept building up. So anyway, we became very successful, and that led to Coca-Cola buying Columbia, and Coca-Cola bought Columbia for $74 a share. So in 4 years' time, we'd gone from $3 a share to $74. So,
Wow.
But then there were some problems with dealing with the Coca-Cola people. Much as I liked Roberto Goizueta, who was the head of Coke, his family had fled Cuba. When Castro took over, he had nothing, but he was going to Yale and had a chemistry degree, came out and went to work for the Coca-Cola company, and I think was the first non sort of standard white American that had ever headed that company.
Wow.
So, and he was very successful with it. But they were known for their marketing, which they did a great job with. They started interfering a bit with our marketing, and I tried to cooperate with them. They sent in a research expert named Dr. Roy Stout, and Dr. Roy Stout was regarded as something of a genius within Coca-Cola, and he had long meetings with me because he was trying to figure out a research method of getting like a list of 10 things, a checklist for motion pictures, what you needed to have in order to have a hit. And I had said, I think there are, some things that are very difficult to quantify, and I think entertainment's one of them, but I tried to be very helpful. I told him, much of the research that had been done by the networks on entertainment, they had studied everything, testing premises, testing, like a show like All in the Family that Norman Lear had, they made one pilot on it and that network didn't pick it up, and then they did another pilot. Finally, the third pilot they had, and it became a big hit. The problem with some of the research is it was very good at sort of validating the familiar. People could understand something that was like something they'd seen before, and it eliminated the worst stuff. The problem was the testing also tended to eliminate the very best stuff. It was unique. And therefore, that's where personal judgment had to come in. And, you say, I don't care what they say, this is a good premise. I had that.
It's like gut versus data.
Well, it's gut judgment, experience over the years, and I had that on, Kramer versus Kramer, that the head of distribution had given me a very low estimate on what it would do domestically. I think he said $8 million. Well, the budget was $8 million. So
is this Columbia?
Columbia.
Wow.
All of this is Columbia.
All my favorite movies.
And the marketing department had tested the premise, and the premise tested poorly. And I said, well, I don't believe that test. There's something wrong there. It's probably the way the premise is written. Anyway, we went ahead with it. It was a big hit movie. So all the research was just wrong. So that's what you have to be careful about. It can sometimes predict a hit where you don't have one. I had one that called...
So Kramer versus Kramer was your gut, not your data.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, very much. Yeah, the head of distribution and marketing, which I didn't control when I was first head of Columbia, I think he tried to sabotage the picture because it was clear to me he tried to do that because he set up our first sneak preview in Kansas City. Now, here is a picture which was about New York.
Yeah.
The lead character was Jewish. I think he was trying to find a place. He was Jewish too. His name was Norman Levy. But I think he was trying to find a place where it would test poorly and prove his estimate to be right. So he miscalculated. They loved it in Kansas City. The night we all flew into Kansas City and we went to the theater, and it was explosive because the audience just went wild. They loved it. People were coming out of there saying it touched them. It was their story. They felt part of it. So I think any research tools, as I had, my right-hand man was a guy I'd met when he was at ABC named Marvin Antonowski, and he was out of research. He had gone to Baruch College and had a marketing degree from them, and so numbers were really his thing. But he was first to say research is part science and part art. You can't do the science without the art too. So that's one of the reasons I kept him handy over the years. I had him when I was running Universal Television. I took him with me to Columbia. I took him with me when I came back to Universal. Took him to Columbia again. So and because Marvin was brilliant and did know when to what that difference was. We had a picture called The Competition, which Richard Dreyfuss and I think Amy Irving starred in. And we got fantastic numbers when we tested it in Phoenix. And Marvin was suspicious about it because the competition was about these two people or musicians who played classical music, pianists, so on. And he said, I think they're lying to us, the audience. I don't think they like it as much, because there was something in the research he could see that while they just loved it, when it came down to the category of would you recommend it to your friends, that was weak. So that said there's some flaw here. So, and he was right, it was weak. The people felt that since it was classical music, they had to say they liked it very much, whether they did or didn't. So, like they all read the New York Times, nobody reads the National Enquirer.
Wow.
So.
Yeah, it's like today's software algorithm. Back then, you guys were doing it manually.
Yeah. Anyway, with the interference on market, some of the Coca-Cola interference, I finally figured it out with them. And I explained it to Roberto at one point. I said, the difference in marketing is, it's like if I had opened Tootsie in 1890 and all I had to do was refresh the advertising over the years. Coca-Cola, you have the same product. It's been there all along. Whereas with the motion picture, I'm starting a new business every month. It's a new picture. I have all my money spent before I can really research it and test it and put it in front of an audience. Mm-hmm. I can't do taste tests. I've got to then prepare an advertising campaign that's, it's not like I know the product is acceptable, like Coca-Cola. They can refresh that advertising all the time. With me, you open and you develop a whole new campaign. And basically, with running a motion picture studio, you need at least one picture a month. So you're starting a new business.
So you're ideally pulling out 12 pictures a year?
You need, in order to support a distribution operation, you need to release at least 12 pictures a year.
Wow.
You can't really, or at that time, I don't know how it is today, it's probably similar, but you can't really handle more than 20, unless they're all flops. If they're flops, you can handle an infinite number of them, but you want time for your pictures to play, right. And there are only so many screens available, so you don't want to push your own pictures out of the screens. You want them to play as long as they can while they're making money. So, but anyway, the conflict led me to leave Columbia, and I went to Universal. I was in MCA Universal. It was very unusual for anybody to ever be asked back. I think I was the only one. Because if you left, you were a traitor, and never worked there again.
Wow.
So
You'll never work in this town again.
so anyway, I went back and I was head of Universal Television, Universal Pictures then, and chairman of the MCA Motion Picture Group.
What year was that?
That was 84.
Wow.
And I left a huge hit for Columbia when I left, because it was Ghostbusters. They had tried to stop me from making Ghostbusters because the corporate New York was worried it was a comedy and it was expensive. I think the budget was $27 million, and the common wisdom was you wouldn't spend that kind of money on a comedy. And I said, well, this is unique. It's not, it's a comedy, but on the other hand, it's a special effects ghost story. That's why it's expensive. I got to pay for the actors that are, Bill Murray's now getting a lot of money, and Aykroyd and Ramis, and I've got to do special effects. So I think it'll be a big hit, but I don't think we'll lose much money if it's not. So, but they sent one of the company lawyers out, and I think it was the kabuki dance that they made it very clear to Coca-Cola that they were all against doing it, but I insisted on doing it. So therefore, they would not be blamed when it failed. So therefore, what they did is set up a situation where everybody at Coca-Cola and Columbia called me when I was not Universal, newly at Universal, to say thank you very much for making this movie, because nobody had ever seen that much money coming in. So it was just...
So they did say thank you.
Oh, yes.
Oh,
they
nice.
were. That's why one of the reasons when I left Universal, they wanted me back at Columbia again. So, but at Universal, I managed to get fortuitously a couple of movies that I had developed at Columbia that had not been made yet, and one was out of Africa. That was fairly easy to get out of there because...
So for the new people that are watching, when you leave a studio, you can take projects that you own as part of the deal to your new studio, no?
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
No, studio owns everything and they control
Columbia
everything.
owned Out of Africa.
Yeah.
And then you brought it over? Or?
I had the fortunate kind of cooperation of some ineffectual management at Columbia.
Got it.
Out of Africa was sitting there. Ray Stark, the important producer on the Columbia lot, close to management there, he wanted to do The Way We Were 2. He needed Robert Redford and Sidney Pollack for that picture.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one factor. So Ray was prepared to kill Out of Africa. So it wasn't going to be made there. Also, Guy McElwain had been in love with a picture that was made in Africa called Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, that we developed. He was my, I was chairman of Columbia at that point. He was president. And I didn't like the script, but he got infatuated with the process, and I forget the name of the actress that...
It did get made, yeah.
It got made, and I think Guy was spending far too much time in wardrobe outfitting the lead actress. So I was leaving, and I said, I would kill this right now, Guy. I convened a meeting in my office with all the departments to basically go through and say, would you make this? A guy was there, so they all said they wouldn't make it. It was fairly negative. And so I sent them all out except for Guy. And then I said, Guy, I think this is a bad mistake. I'm not going to cancel it. You got to tell me. That would cost a lot of money to shut it down and then he restarts it again. So that would be stupid. So I said, I'll do what you want to do, but I would recommend that you not make it. He said he wanted to. So anyway, it was a terrible picture. So that put a sour taste in everybody's mouth about Africa. It's hard to control costs and that. But anyway, then I am over at Universal and I'm trying to put it together. I had talked to Sidney Pollack, and Ray knew that. I had talked to Sidney Pollack about directing it, and Sidney had said to me, Frank, I don't want to spend the next year of my life in Africa. And I said, Sidney, I think it's an important project, and I think you're the right guy to do it, and I don't have any other choice of anybody to do it. I don't trust anybody else 12,000 miles away. So Sidney and I had started on half-hour television westerns. We had worked on them together. So I knew he could take any condition that came along. So, but he was dragging his feet. So, and Ray was trying to get him. So, but Redford read the script and liked it, which that was an important factor because his role was basically the supporting role in it. The lead was the woman, was Baroness von Blixen. So, so the fact that Redford liked it was a critical factor to me. And finally, Sidney got persuaded between me, Redford, and the writer, Kurt Ludke, because Kurt knew Redford also. So he had written Absence of Malice that we had produced with Redford.
Certainly feel that Absence of Malice was Newman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Paul Newman, Southfield, Kurt Ludke wrote it, Sidney Pollack directed it. So that started locking out. I had trouble at Universal because Sidney Sheinberg, who was the president of MCA, had read the script, and I met with him as we were locking it all in, and he said, Frank, I read this. I don't understand it. Why you'd be making this? I said, well, I understand it. It's a love story set in Africa, and Robert Redford understands it, and Sidney Pollack understands it. So I don't know why you don't understand it. So, we anyway got it together. And I think the budget was $27 million, although I had a meeting we were trying to cast, and we were having a lot of trouble with the lead in it. Meryl Streep really wanted to play it, and both of us had the reservation that Meryl Streep's a terrific actress, but in the whole romantic area, sex appeal and so on, that she'd never shown much of that. So her career had not been built on romantic stories. So, and we were thinking Jessica Lange. We could not find the leading woman we really envisioned. Sam Cohn, Meryl's agent, kept calling all the time. He was pushing and pushing. So I talked with Bob. he finally said to me that he felt that with the reservations he could make it work with Merrill if we were using, if Bob Redford, it was very clear how much he loved her. And we started to lock her in. I got to back up a minute because when we were budgeting it, there were, Sidney came to me and there were two budgets. There was one at 17 million if we made it with Jeremy Irons, and there was the 27 or 8 million if we made it with Redford. The additional cost, part of it was paying Redford more, but also Redford's retinue. There were, the people, the wardrobe people, the makeup people, so on, all of whom came at a premium compared to what would happen with Jeremy Irons. He felt he could make a good picture either way, which did I want to do. And I said, with all due respect, I'd go for the higher budget with Redford, because since we can't guarantee how the picture will turn out, if it's disappointing, if it's mediocre, if the romance doesn't work, if you don't have chemistry between those two leads, you got a real dud, and that's very hard to predict if the chemistry is going to be there. So I said, if it doesn't work and I got Jeremy Irons, I have all the ancillary markets in that are worthless. I don't have Europe, whereas if I've got Redford, it's going to play everywhere.
Yeah.
It will still play in, video cassette, and some people will see the Redford movie. So the secure choice is 28 million, not 17. So we locked that in and set it up, and there were a lot of problems in Africa because I had to deal with the fact that we were about a week from shooting, and they called me to say that our rain charts hadn't worked out, that there'd been drought all the time, and they were trying to calculate what to do because they could drill wells and pump water and keep where we were shooting green, but they were worried about the PR aspect. If people were dying of thirst and we're trying to pump water to spray on plants, that would be pretty bad publicity. So did I want them to close up and go find another place? And I said, don't close up yet. I said, keep going, maybe the rain will come. It's not going to cost us any more to move a month from now than it will today. If we have to shut down, about the same amount. So as it turned out, it started raining, I think a week after that. And unfortunately, it kept raining. So but there's where it helped so much that I had Sidney Pollack, because Sidney, who had shot television with me, we shot in the rain. It was, the camera doesn't pick up the rain unless it's lit for that. You've got to light the rain to see it. We used to have to caution our Western actors if they were doing dialogue and they had their Stetsons on. The only thing, don't lean forward, because they lean forward, then there will be a rivulet running down. You can see that. That's not a raindrop. So as long as they didn't lean forward, you could keep shooting in the rain. So anyway, Sidney did a great job of shooting where the rain was light, moving scenes inside that if he needed something to shoot, and keep going. So he managed to get it pretty much on budget. We were very little over.
Wow.
which most directors would have been saying, oh, we can't shoot today, it's raining, or there's this problem, there's that problem. Sidney, one of the great things was with him was that he treated the money like it was his own. So he was very responsible in everything he did. And that's one of the key decisions I could make as head of a studio, the choice of who's going to direct, because I always figured that's my way of controlling the budget. If I get the right director, I'll control the budget. If I don't have the right director, it's impossible. You've got to fire the guy and put somebody else on there.
Did you also count on the first AD? What I've learned is the studio heads love first ADs because they can control the directors and they make sure that the director is in line. So
they can do a certain amount, but it basically, if the director doesn't want to be controlled, he's not going to be controlled.
But you've known that relationship with Pollock really helped.
Yeah, well, but that's the way Sidney was. He would be that way, and he was responsible. So, and I learned my lessons in television. I learned who to stay away from, who not to have as a director. There were directors that would never shoot anything on schedule. My solution to that was very simple. I never used them. So I always checked, how did they do? What's their record elsewhere? So if I had one rule when I ran Universal Television, that we just didn't employ directors that had consistently went over budget. You can understand somebody miscalculating occasionally, but not if it's regular. So the other one that the other big hit that I had to extract from Columbia, I developed with Bob Zemeckis and Bob Gale Back to the Future, and in the whole transition, getting out of Columbia and going to Universal and that, it was sitting there. It was one of the developed properties. We hadn't moved with it yet. And there was interest in it. Spielberg was interested in becoming, taking that over, but we had to get it out of Columbia. And clearly, if anybody heard that Spielberg was interested in it, they would shut the door. We'd never get it out of Columbia. But that's where I got very lucky, because I got a call from McElwain, who needed a favor. They had developed a script to star Peter Falk, and they were about a week from shooting. And the script was like Double Indemnity. In fact, it was so much like Double Indemnity that they had a legal liability, which he'd found out from his lawyers. It was exactly like Double Indemnity. So what he wanted from me, could he get a license to do Double Indemnity, which we owned at Universal. And I didn't want to let him know what I was up to, but I saw an opportunity. And I said, well, there are a couple of 3 properties that I developed that I would like to keep developing. And so I named a couple and Back to the Future. And I said, I won't charge you a license, but if you give me those properties, we'll give you a license.
Nice.
So he accepted my generous deal, and we got Back to the Future.
How was his movie then? Did it turn out okay?
A disaster. I mean, it was just a bad movie. So, and I liked Peter, so it's too bad. I'd dealt with him a lot on Columbo, and he was difficult, a perfectionist, but very talented, and certainly played that character terrific.
So can I segue you out to something?
You can.
So I did like, just for the fans out there, you also, when you left, you went to Sony, and you developed, after Sony, I know you did Boyz in the Hood, right?
Well, that was when you say Sony, that was going back to Columbia Pictures.
Yeah, take me there.
I was at Universal, and to some extent, to a big extent, going back to Universal had its very negative side. I think somehow it was like I was a transplant and the body wasn't taking it. I think Lou Wasserman wanted me back, and I don't think Sid Sheinberg did. And there was quite a conflict there. Somebody had greenlighted a lot of bad pictures. And when I went in, I saw why they wanted me there, because they had a real mess on their hand. There was Streets of Fire, I think, was one of the pictures.
Mine didn't do too good. Gotcha.
Well, Gotcha was my decision.
It revived in cable. Did okay in cable.
Good. It was a good picture. So, but there was one starring Tom Cruise, and I can't remember the title of it.
Days of Thunder?
No, this was a fairy tale.
Oh, the legend.
Yeah, legend.
Yeah, that was
just bizarre.
That's horrific.
And nobody was responsible. You couldn't find who greenlighted this. What? So anyway, it was time for me to get out of there, and I was offered deals. Eisner wanted me at Disney. Rupert Murdoch and Diller wanted me at Fox. But just before making a decision, I went up to, Catherine and I were in Alaska on Herb Allen and Allen and Company had taken over a lodge there, and we'd generally gone up every year. And Herb quietly said to me, where nobody could hear, we were out in a boat, and Catherine and I had been out fishing. Herb was out with Ann Reinking, his girlfriend at the time, and they were fishing. Herb came alongside, asked if Catherine would get off the boat, stay with Ann. He sat with me and basically said, don't sign anything for the next month. And then got the boat back, he went away, so I thought, I trusted Herb. I thought, well, he's got something in mind, so I made sure my deals didn't close. I was close to closing a deal with Murdoch and Diller. But suddenly I got a call from Columbia, and they want to offer me a very big independent producer deal. Autonomy, I can greenlight my own pictures, stock in the company, and so it was such a great deal. I took it, and I let Rupert know I wasn't coming, and what I realized a few months later when Herb sold the company to Sony, that what he was doing was dressing up the company for the sale. He brought me back. I had been head of it when it was very successful. After I left, under the two studio heads next, one of whom was McElwain and the other was David Putnam, the studio just went down there were no hits. And they had things like Ishtar and, a
movie I auditioned for, but go ahead.
So Well, what's his name? The star.
Dustin
No.
or Warren Beatty?
Warren.
Yeah.
Warren
They all
pitched.
took $5 million. It was so famous, the story.
Warren pitched that to me when I was head of Columbia, and I liked Warren. I enjoyed spending time with him. He's made several pitches to me. I've never gone for one of. He pitched Reds to me. He pitched this to me. He pitched Dick Tracy to me. But this was the best pitch because he told the story, and he said it was hilarious. And the reason it was hilarious was that Dustin wound up getting the girl. That was his explanation. That's why it was so funny. So I didn't find it sounded that funny. So I, as a matter of fact, thought that what Warren was trying to do was what an actor I really liked, Bill Murray and Aykroyd and Raymond, what they did. They were a much younger version, and it worked with it. They knew how to do it. They were comics. Warren was a terrific actor, but not a comic, and there's a big difference. So, anyway, I had turned down Ishtar, but I think Guy, as somebody once said about Guy, he never saw a script he didn't like. So, anyway. So I went through the whole thing. Sony bought the studio. What Herb had in mind was, and he had discussed this with Sony, I would run the new operation. So I met with the people, Mickey Schulhoff, who was the guy speaking for Sony in this country. And the deal was going to be closed. Suddenly I didn't hear from Mickey, and time went by. I called Herb and I said, something's odd because there's no communication now. So he said, well, let me find out what's going on. So turned out that, the next thing that happened, turned out Walter Yetnikoff. Walter Yetnikoff, who had been head of CBS Records when Sony bought CBS Records, and that had turned out very well for them. But, it was a terrific investment. They were making a lot of money on that. So when Walter Yetnikoff found out that I was going to be head of this, he had been in a rehab program, I think, in Minnesota somewhere, and heard about it. He got out of there, came back, got hold of the Sony people, and said that they were making a terrible mistake, that the right people to run this were Goober and Peters. And once that became a fact, there I was. I had my independent deal there, but any deal is dependent totally on who you're dealing with. They can screw you every which way. So Goober wanted me to head the motion picture. He wanted me to head Columbia Pictures. So I figured my independent deal is not going to work, so we'll convert it into, studio head deal. I told my lawyer, who happened to be Peter's lawyer, I said, I want basically a mirror image of Peter's deal. Whatever he's got, I'm sure I'll profit because Peter looks after himself pretty well. So we got that deal together. I wasn't as rich as Peter's deal, but it was, every step of it was the same. So I discovered that one of the nice things, the minute I signed the deal, I got a bonus. So that Peter looked out, that was in his deal. So, I also, since I didn't think the deal would probably work, I had clauses very specifically that one, I had to be in Los Angeles to do my job, that I would only report to Peter. Other provisions so they couldn't suddenly sign me to Alaska and Anchorage, Alaska, and say your duties are performed there. So I had a good period on getting some good pictures going. I worked with Penny Marshall and greenlighted, got out of Fox a project she had been working on there, which was abandoned.
A League of Her Own. Right?
League of Their Own, yeah. So, and Awakenings, that's how I met her. So Penny was great to work with.
Yeah.
I was a big fan of hers. So, did I shift away from?
No, you're good.
Okay. I'll tell you the Boyz in the Hood story, because I had just taken over at Columbia, just come in. Part of the terrible thing with the Goober Peters thing was they were under contract to Warner Brothers, and in buying them out and trying to work that whole deal out, Columbia lost the half ownership of the Warner Brothers lot.
Wow.
Had to buy the old MGM Culver City lot, which Lorimar had operated, and then a lot of money was spent on refurbishing that, and then we went into the new offices, the lavish offices that were there, in the old Thalberg building. So, but the first weekend, the first week, Amy Pascal, who was one of the creative vice presidents there, came to me with an assistant of hers, whose name I should remember because I like her and she's talented. Maybe it'll pop back to me. So the two of them wanted me to read a script called Boyz in the Hood, which had been around town for some months. And it was a kind of writing sample. And nobody really wanted to do it because it was inner city ghetto picture. And the other thing was that the young guy who had written it wanted to direct it. So he'd never directed anything before. So they wanted me to read it, so they recommended it. So I took it home and I was just blown away when I read it. It was a terrific script. So, and I thought, not really ghetto script any more than, I thought audiences would be able to relate to it because it's like when I saw The Bicycle Thief when I was 18 or so. But the fact that it was Rome and different culture and all that didn't make me like it any less. So I thought we can get audiences to like this. So on Monday when I came back, I met with Amy. I said I want to meet with him, with John Singleton. So they brought him in, and I said to him, well, tell me how you would approach this. So I said, for instance, on this scene where you've got the helicopters and it's night and the inner city and so on. And said, well, I don't need helicopters. I can do that with sound and light. So I found, well, he was thinking right. He was being creative on and addressing the costs. I then said, all right, let's talk casting. Where would you, who are you thinking about? And I didn't know the people he was talking about, so I said, look, we'll give you the equipment, you go shoot these people. I want to see them on film. And it'd be on tape, actually, but So the next thing was he brought back some footage, some test sequences. The first one he showed me was Ice Cube, and I thought, I was again blown away. I thought, wow, this guy, that's strong, good. So Cuba Gooding, I mean, his choices were all superb. So I then, I think I was working, Michael Nathanson was the president of production. So I talked to him and I said, what we have to do is surround him with people who are very experienced. We've got to have a producer that is not going to crush what he's going to do. I want to make sure, my belief, I operate on a simple belief, that if anybody could write a brilliant script like that, they've already directed it once. They knew what they wanted and they put it on paper, so therefore they should be able to direct the picture. But anyway, I thought we need somebody who has worked with somebody highly creative and knows how to handle them. So Steve Nicolaitis had worked with Rob Reiner, and we thought that would be the right guy to put with John Singleton, because experienced professional, he'd be able to make sure he didn't fall into the potholes along the way, and yet he wouldn't crush his creative instincts. So that's how we set the picture up. And originally, I wanted to do it for $4 million, but it turned out that to do that, we'd have to go to Texas, we'd have to shoot it somewhere else. And there clearly was a value in shooting it in LA. But in LA, you're shooting under the noses of the unions, and so instead of 6, it turned out it would be $6 million to do it. So I approved doing it for 6, and we worked on the whole thing of how do we make this acceptable to a white audience, so it's not labeled a ghetto movie that white audiences then won't go to. So that's when I think Marvin Antonowski came up with the idea of let's take it to Cannes. So by entering in the Cannes Film Festival, we weren't in the competition, but we were in some director's special kind of thing. It allowed us to show. So we decided to make an event out of Cannes. We rented billboards in Cannes and around Nice, and we put graffiti up. And they'd never seen graffiti there. They wondered, what is all this? It created a buzz, a curiosity. We also flew over Ice Cube and his group, so we put on a rap concert. They'd never seen that before in Cannes. So we had the Europeans, the French there. So, and we screened it for Roger Ebert, who wrote a love letter, a great review on it. When we screened it at Cannes, by the time that screening came, we got an 700-seat theater, and every seat was filled, and there were about 700 people outside waiting to get in. So we had to do extra screenings, and the reception was superb to it. But all the publicity we got,
Europe,
it was all done for the United States.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to make sure that the New York Times, the the right newspapers were covering it, and that the white audience became aware of it. So, and we then sold it that way. And the interesting thing was, it became a highly successful picture. I think our $6 million movie, we did 60 million, I believe, in domestic box office. So, and what was great was that the audience demographics, it was by the end of the run, it was half white and half black.
And so, this was a Columbia.
That was Columbia, yeah.
Oh, Gladiator, yeah, you did a movie.
With Steve Roth.
Right, and that company was a different company.
Yeah, that was a leftover from Price Entertainment.
Right, gotcha.
Which we'd had to dissolve that company, but the picture still got made. And,
right.
Harold Ramis came to me because Harold and I know each other well from Stripes and Ghostbusters, and Harold had a script that he was based at Warner Brothers, and he'd been to everybody in town, and this was Groundhog Day. So, and the script didn't quite make it, but Harold told me what he wanted to do. He wanted to rewrite the script, and so I paid for, I acquired the script and paid for his rewrite. And after I read it, I thought, this is great. So, and I said, I'm greenlighting it if we can get either Bill Murray or Chevy Chase. And we got Bill. So I had done one picture. I think Chevy Chase was one of the more talented comics around. But he did too much unworthy material. Often he'd do crappy pictures. But I had him in a picture at Universal called Fletch. But I like comedy, and so I had a good record with comedy. But Groundhog Day was unique. Again, that was one of those things, one of the pictures that everybody in town said is too intellectual, that won't work with audiences. So,
I had a 4-hour convo with him, and I was in Sundance with him. And
Harold?
And he told me it's very Buddhist, because he's a Buddhist, and it has a lot of spiritual connotation into it.
Oh, very much.
Yeah.
And philosophically, it's
incredible.
In philosophy departments in colleges across the country, it is frequently used as material to study the philosophy of it.
He's brilliant. So,
that was. Then there was Savoy Pictures, where
that's what it was, Savoy.
Yeah, Savoy after Columbia, because unbeknownst to me, but no surprise, Goober and Peters had Mark Canton, who was their buddy at Warner Brothers, and he couldn't get out of his contract. That's why Goober wanted me to run it until they could get him out of there. So once he was out of there, they wanted to replace me. None of the pictures had come out yet, everything I'd been doing wasn't out yet. So, Victor Kaufman, who had worked for me at Columbia, was developing Savoy Pictures, so I made a deal with Savoy, an independent producer deal. By the way, on that Hit and Run book,
I had the nerve to go up to Goober, and I go, "Hey, I read this book on you. True, right?" And he goes, "I wouldn't read that crap." I went to John Peters, and I said, "True?" And John Peters goes, "Yep."
Well, he was the source of it. He was the source of it. I think the writer got taken in by John, who manipulates women fairly well. So, what's her name? Kim.
But they weren't
Kim
too
Mas-
nice to the two of them. They were really
no. But you'll notice, you probably may not have noticed or remembered it, but she, all the hit pictures that I had developed and put in work and left behind, the success of them was all because of Mark Canton's brilliant marketing. That's why League of Their Own worked, that's why Groundhog Day worked, that's why Boyz n the Hood worked. However, her book came out, and then Mark Canton's pictures started coming out, the ones he greenlighted. Last Action Hero, and nothing worked. So,
what was that point where you just said, "I'm out. I'm gonna"?
Well, at Savoy, I didn't like the way the company was being run. I wasn't in charge, and I think Victor and Luke Corman, it was basically their company, put together with Allen and Company money and that. So they were alienating the agents, and there were a couple of things that went wrong. One was they didn't have in place the foreign output deal that was supposed to be in place. So that meant every picture had to be approved by the new people who would do foreign. So it's very hard to put pictures together that way. You're dependent on the taste of the foreign buyers then. So, and if you leave it up to them, most of your big hits will never get made. So that was unanticipated. The other thing was that I was supposed to own the negatives after 21 years. And by the time we actually put the deal together, that turned out, I think the banks had forced them to not have that provision, that they weren't able to give it to me. I'd been promised it, but the deal hadn't been signed. So that made a difference. But we had, I think, some good movies. I got A Bronx Tale together.
Yeah, I love that movie.
And then one that I made in Ireland called Circle of Friends.
Deborah Winner?
No. The Ireland one was Minnie Driver and Chris O'Donnell.
That's right, young kid.
And the guy who played in King's Speech. Terrific actor.
Yeah, the stutter.
Yeah, great actor. And we had a good cast, and it was good. And I wanted to do that movie because Irish-made films had trouble doing business here, and I wanted to try one that where people could understand the Irish accent. So by dealing with these three girls who were going to Trinity College, Dublin, it was more of a middle-class accent rather than the lower-class accent, which is very hard for an American audience to follow. I'm of some Irish background, so I found, I forget which picture it was, that it took me 20 minutes of sitting there to get used to the dialect, the Irish dialect, and where I could finally grasp what they were saying. So in Circle of Friends, accents were good. I was there for we were there actually, we went over, and we were there for all the casting, the reading, to make sure, because I didn't want to trust, even though we had a good director who was Irish, I thought you need American ears to make sure you can we can understand it. They're too used to all these peculiar accents. So it did good business. The other one I thought was just great was I'd gotten the rights when I was at Universal to the play Shadowlands, which was done in London, a very successful play, and no, I got the rights to that when I was headed Columbia the second time. I had left Universal, so it was Columbia the second time. And I got Sidney Pollack. He was going to do it. Unfortunately, in the bidding for it, the guy who had replaced me at Universal was Tom Pollack. And Tom was also trying to he wanted Sidney Pollack. So we had a bidding war going on. And I finally got it, but some of the provisions were onerous that I had to agree to, particularly with regard to the controls that the producer had, the English producer. And I had figured I'm going to sit down with him after we try to make this and say, these are unreasonable positions, and they're going to hurt the picture, and I'm sure I would have worked it out with him. But anyway,
who starred in that?
Right?
Is that?
Well, what happened was I left Columbia, was with Savoy, and then Columbia abandoned it, and Sidney's work on it went down the drain. But it got put back together by the producer who had Dickie Attenborough directing, not Sidney Pollack. And Attenborough and I had worked together on Gandhi and Cry Freedom, and so that was an easy get back together again thing. So I got it, and then we started casting, and Anthony Hopkins, that was kind of easy. He was, one of Catherine's classmates at RADA, Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. So, and I put him in when we did Bram Stoker's Dracula at Columbia with Francis Coppola directing. We put him in that picture, so it was Old Home Week with Tony again. So we had Tony Hopkins, and then Deborah Winger.
That's the one. Yeah, I remember that.
I had to fire her from A League of Their Own, or replace her. We were casting, and I think Penny was doing a kind of workout rehearsal, seeing which of the ladies, how athletic they were, what they could do. Baseball team, so not everybody's an athlete. So, but Deborah had said to Penny that she didn't want us to do what we were doing, which was to cast Madonna in it. She objected that strenuously, and she threatened Penny. She said it's going to be a long hot summer in shooting if we do cast her. So she was indicating she would create trouble. So Penny came to me and said she didn't know what to do, and I said, well, let me get into it. So I said, we can't have an actor threatening you that way. So I told her agent, I think it was Rick Nacita, that we were going to replace her. Well, she wanted to have a meeting with me, so I agreed. She came in with her agent, Rick, and I think it was Barry Hirsch, her lawyer.
Wow.
So, and she talked to me for about an hour. And at the end of the hour, I said, you know, what I haven't heard from you in the hour is an apology or any acknowledgement that you did anything wrong. It is all the hour. What I've heard is self-justification in why what you did is right. And of course, it's not right. You don't threaten the director. You know, we are going to cast Madonna, and we can't take the risk that you're going to just be troublesome because of that. So that was the end of the meeting. And actually, I think we lucked out in casting Gina Davis.
Oh, it was a great movie.
Yeah, who I think she was better suited to it anyway. But in casting, one of the things I saw about Deborah, because I'd had her in Legal Eagles, where she was troublesome, and then there was this situation. But I found it was always about another woman. That seemed to trigger the problem. The good thing about Shadowlands, and I thought she was perfect casting for it, was there were no other women in the picture, and it would be directed by Lord Attenborough. I thought that's sufficiently intimidating. And Sir Anthony Hopkins was her co-star. So I was willing to take the chance. And she was very well behaved in that picture.
It's a great movie.
And she did a good job.
Yeah.
So, very talented actress.
She's not the only one I've heard that when there's two women on the set, it's a bit rough.
Well, I, looking back, realized that that's where all the problems started.
Yeah. You can only love one woman on the screen at a time. So, you want to take a break real quick?
I'm prepared to go. It's up to you.
So, what? So, can you segue out of this into how you left that, and then where I come in, where you start talking about your fascination for genealogy and?
Oh, okay. Anyway, I was disappointed with what happened at Savoy because the company just wasn't set up right. Vic and Lou alienated too many agents, and you know you need them on your side. You can't be constantly at war with them. So they were at war with a lot of things. So I had said to Herb Allen, you got to sell this because it's not working, and it's too hard to get the product, and we're not getting top of the line material. So even I can't get it. So he did finally make a deal. I think Barry Diller acquired the remains of the company because, and I think there was some good financial reason for him to do it because there was a lot of cash still in the till. So, and the investors got their money back. I'd invested in the company, and we got our money back. And the Pritzkers had half the money into that, so they got their money back. So, but I had decided at that point, you know, I had really done about everything I wanted to do, and I had lost two key relationships. So I'd have to do some rebuilding. Two relationships that had been very helpful to me. One was with Mike Ovitz, because when I took over Columbia Pictures. CAA wanted to get into motion pictures. And I was kind of low man on the totem pole in motion pictures, because other people already had all the relationships. If I talked to Stan Kamen about his clients, well, I might be number 10 on his call list. So I wasn't going to get a break that way. So whereas Ovitz was the new guy. We had never gotten to know each other in television after he opened the agency, because they were trying to get agency package commissions and do various things, and we didn't give them at Universal, and we had our own package commission. So, Mike told me he was every year had that unpleasant surprise that he thought he knew the schedules and what would happen, and at the last minute I would come up with shows, and suddenly shows that he thought he had sold would be off the schedule and my shows would be in there. So he told me this later in motion picture days. So anyway, I realized that I wasn't going to get anything from Stan Kamen, so I thought there was a reason for being close to Ovitz. So I think most of the agents that were part of forming CIA will say that I was a big key to how they were able to really get into the motion picture end, because when he was about to lose Sean Connery and told me that he was panicked over it, we had a picture to put Sean Connery in, so he was able to get a job for Sean. So with Richard Brooks' film called Wrong is Right, so which Ray Stark was producing. So when I had picture with Paul Newman and Sally Field, Absence of Malice, and we had a premiere in Washington, D.C. I had I had the Columbia jet, so I flew back with Ovitz on the plane, and I gave Sally Field a flight too. So Sally was Stan Kamen's client, so Ovitz had 5 hours with the client so we did a lot of things that he helped me, I helped them. And Mike might come out and make a deal with Eli Horowitz, who was our head of business affairs, on a project, and then he'd go back to the office, and somebody would tell him what was wrong with the deal. I think it was Ray Kurtzman, who was their head of business affairs, smart guy and really knew deals. And Mike wasn't as good. So Mike would call me and say, I made a mistake and you got to help me out. You got to, adjust this deal. You got to do so and so. So I would say, okay, Mike. So I'd go to Eli and say, Eli, we need to change the deal this way. So I'd get him out of trouble. So, I had worked out well for him and for me that I generally got kind of a first look at what they were coming up with. So, and he could depend on me that I would not say anything. It wouldn't seem like I had the first look if I turned it down. That was so he could take it fresh to everybody else. He got very unhappy with agenting. And I remember, that's tangent.
But tell me the second person that you said you lost.
Ray.
Ray Stark.
Ray was a great help, great defender of mine, great friend of mine, and he would always alert me if something was because Ray knew everything.
He's a producer, right?
Producer and power broker. So,
just knows everything.
Yeah. So he supported me at Columbia. He supported me after that. Then, after his wife died, Fran was the daughter of Fanny Brice, and was responsible in a sense for Ray's big producing career, because he was able to get the rights to Funny Girl. But it's Fanny Brice's story. So Fanny Brice didn't want her daughter marrying Ray, but her daughter married Ray anyway. So, but after Fran died, Ray, who'd always been a bit of a playboy, so but it was no fun being a playboy once Fran died, I guess. So he stopped his interest in younger ladies. So, but he got fixated on doing Annie 2, and it was a terrible script, and I'd always been able to reason with Ray, and if he was trying to make something and I didn't like it, I would tell him the truth, and I'd say, at Columbia, Ray, you really want to make this? I'll go with your judgment, but I think it's a bad idea. And on Annie 2, I said, Ray, this is a bad script. This is just crap. You're an important producer of quality pictures. You don't want your name on this. You shouldn't do it. So he would go away, but then he'd come back. And I think the reason that he kept doing that is that Annie was a big disappointment to him.
The original.
Yeah. He tried to make that into a picture beyond what it was. And, the Broadway play was good. We should have done that. That's what I wanted to do. I originally had Randall Fleiser on that. He was going to do it. We would have had a hit, and that would have been it. But the producer was David Beagleman. And when Beagleman left...
Was that with Finney?
What?
Albert Finney?
Yeah.
Oh, that's the movie with Albert Finney.
Yeah.
No, I love the movie anyway because Albert's in it.
Well, he's good. But there were a lot of things wrong with it.
Yeah.
It could have been a much better picture.
Yeah.
Anyway, we had John Huston directing it, not a sentimental bone in his body, and he was on his deathbed, basically. He never got out of his director's chair. He was seeing everything on a television monitor, and with tubes coming out of his nose with the oxygen. So, and Ray is not sentimental. So what happened when Beagleman left as producer of Annie, and he went to, I think, MGM, did nothing. That was just a failed thing after he did that. But Ray suddenly volunteered to take over Annie. And even though I didn't think he was the perfect guy to do it, he was a powerful political player at Columbia. And it would be impossible for me to turn down this help without a lot of political fallout. So I had to go with that. But then he brought in a new writer, Carol Sobieski, who was not good for the material. The playwright had done a brilliant job of making this cartoon strip into a popular musical.
That's right.
Ray wouldn't deal with him. This was the guy who had solved the problem. He got rid of all the comic strip characters. He made it an identifiable story. Carol Sobieski and Ray brought back in some of the bizarre characters, and Then he did this whole thing on Radio City Music Hall. Let's go to the movies. And it's an unrelated sequence in the movie. It just takes up a lot of time and doesn't advance the story at all. Then he made a
it's
deal.
It's in the play, but they leave stage. They go behind the curtain, right? In the play.
Yeah.
That's all right. Is that right?
Well, it's nothing in the play. So in the movie, it takes up a lot of time. I think Ray thought he was making an Academy Award picture, and that Let's Go to the Movies would persuade everybody. Let's vote for this. It's John Huston's last picture. It's where he put dancing in it because Anne Reinking was Herb Allen's girlfriend and great dancer, and so suddenly we got dancing. We got a more expensive picture. I would have made it for $25 million, and it wound up being made for nearly 40, 35 or 40. So shouldn't have been that expensive. You also made a deal for the premiere with PBS. And that locked us into a date. So I said, this is terrible for us. We can't be locked, that all our competitors can take advantage of that. So anyway, my relationship with Ray was gone. My relationship with Mike was gone. I said, well, I'll have to do this all, I'd have to find out other power players that, where I can depend on. That would take a lot of time, and I'm just not that interested in doing it. It's time to, I've had big hits, I've swept the Academy Awards, I did everything I wanted to do in television. Why keep repeating myself? So the other things in the world to do. So we moved to New York, decided to try living there. We got a great apartment there. Catherine rebuilt it all. I got very interested in genealogy. This was an accident. It really happened because the internet came into being. I had a computer and I saw an ad really that said, check out your genealogy for free. It was a Mormon site called FamilySearch.org. Had I had to pay anything, I wouldn't have gotten into it, but it was for free. So I started putting in some grandparents and great-grandparents' names. Didn't strike oil until my great-grandmother, Sarah Ellen Hull, and there was her name, her father's name, Dr. James Hull, and I kept going back generation by generation in this site, and I got to a George Hull who had arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. And then it traced over to Somersetshire, England. So I thought, oh, this is very interesting. So, but can I believe this? So I checked the internet and I found there was a genealogical researcher in Connecticut that seemed to have good credentials. He had a bachelor's and master's in history from Dartmouth. So I contacted him and I said, look, this is what I've come up with, my genealogical history. I don't know whether I can trust it. I don't know how much of this is true. And I said, could you check this out for me? And if you could you tell me how much you would charge me to check it out? So he said, well, let me check it first and I'll get back to you with what I would charge. So he called me in a day and he said, I don't really have to check it out. He said, your family history is all in a book called The Families of Old Fairfield. It's Connecticut. And he said, this is, the book is written by the father of American genealogy, a man called Donald Lyons Jacobus. and he's got everybody down to your great grandmother in there. So if you get that book, you can check out who your relatives are. So that's where I found that I was related to Aaron Burr. So because when George Hull arrived at the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he was one of those that went first to Windsor, Connecticut, to found that colony. Then he went to Fairfield, Connecticut, where Fairfield County, and he was among the first. He was with the first property owners there. And if you look at the plat of the first property owners, they all married each other over the next 150 years, from 1630 on. And so I'm related to the Hulls that were there, the Sanfords, the Burrs, the Joneses, because the Reverend John Jones was the Puritan minister of that colony, so he's one of the ancestors. So Catherine and I visited the Historical Society in Fairfield one time when we were in New York. We drove up and visited that, and they're right across from where the original city plots were, and the burial areas. So, and they had all the history, which show it's fun because there's Hull Farms Road, which crosses Burr Road on some of the street signs there. So, but as I got interested in it, I was curious on why did people move the way they did? That when you look at people leaving Somersetshire, why did they come to the circumstance? So I really had to study all about the Puritans and what was going on in England at that time in the 17th century. And then once they arrived in this country, it seemed clear that what seemed to happen was every 3 generations they would run out of land, and so the younger ones would move west. So they were in Connecticut, but they went on into then upstate New York, then they went into Ohio or Pennsylvania, and on to Illinois, and so I looked at all that. And I also, because my mother's family was Irish, her name was Moran, and I got some information from her cousins. There was one cousin who'd been a professor at an Illinois university who had done a lot of research on the Irish part of the family. So that was much easier than my father's part, because my mother's ancestors traced back to County Mayo in Ireland, and I know all of them that came from there.
Did you ever get your passport and all that?
I can't, because if it's a grandparent, you can do it, and in my case, it's great-grandparents, so I'm one generation off. But the Morans and the Doyles and the Sweeneys and one unusual name, Solon, which is translated from whatever the Irish name was.
So were the Halls and the Burrs British?
Yes,
Blood?
they came from England. Well, that's how Catherine's ancestors got to Nevis. So her I forget how many generations back it would be, but Edward Huggins was sent as a poor man, as an indentured servant to the island of Nevis. So,
where is that island?
Nevis, St. Kitts and Nevis, it's Caribbean.
Like Alexander Hamilton out there.
Well, he was born in Nevis. So
we could be related.
He was, his background was checkered because his mother's moral character was highly questioned. She got divorced and she was married to this one and that one, and is it's possible that Hamilton is not really his name.
Right.
There was a Hamilton that she was married to, but meanwhile, there was a businessman in St. Kitts that helped pay for his college education, King's College. And that businessman had another son who looked identical to Hamilton. So the speculation is that that guy fathered Hamilton too. So.
I felt happy reading about that. He might have been a bastard, because I'm a bastard. You know, my dad had a nice time with my mom, didn't marry. So.
Well, that's true of Hamilton. So he was called the bastard at the time by his political opponents.
So what was interesting is then, I hope I'm not saying too much, you were then part of the Cincinnati Club, and what is that?
Oh, when I was doing some research on ancestors, one of the ways that I would find out if my research was solid and provable is that there were these ancestral societies, lineage societies, like the Society of the War of 1812. I had an ancestor that was a captain in Ohio during the War of 1812, and I think his name was Drake, and so I submitted my proofs to the Society of the War of 1812 to see if they would criticize them or find them inadequate or that. And they accepted it, but there was a fellow named Rick Brighthouse who contacted me to say, do you know you're related to Aaron Burr and that you could be a member of the Society of the Cincinnati? And I didn't know what the Society of the Cincinnati was, but that is a society, a very exclusive one, that the descendants of the George Washington's Revolutionary War line officers. And it's got the rules of primogeniture, so only one descendant can represent an ancestor.
Living today can represent.
Yeah, one today represents anybody who served, like Aaron Burr.
And nobody was representing Aaron Burr?
The last representation of Representative Burr had died, a couple of decades before.
Great.
And as it turned out, I checked their genealogy, and they were much more distant from Burr than I am.
Right.
So you can't be closer than I am. I'm a first cousin, and you either have to be the direct descendant, or it can be an uncle, or a nephew, or as I am, first cousin. That's as far as the New York State Society will go on it. So I learned a lot about Burr, and because I became fascinated. Who is this guy? And got a bad reputation, as it deserved. So, I think it's fun to have an interesting ancestor, whether they were a good guy or a bad guy. Both can be interesting, and you need to find out why they did what they did. So I concluded Burr was a very good guy, exceptionally good. He was an ardent feminist at a time when that was frowned upon. That's one of the reasons his opponents angered with him. He raised a daughter. He had her educated as you would a son at those days. She learned Latin and Greek and was intellectual. He had very intellectual partners as women. And he had told his daughter that, she had to form her opinions. And whereas Jefferson, in the same age, had told his daughter, that she would get her political opinions from her husband when she married him. So they weren't too open-minded.
So was Burr part of the founding fathers? They, like one of the things that I noticed is as soon as George Washington left, then it was the people that were the founding father-ish. Then when they went, it was like the people that knew. And then eventually, I think by the time it got to Jackson, he was the military guy that fought in the wars, but didn't necessarily.
He was a kid in the Revolutionary War,
Right.
but was a hero of the War of 1812. He won the
Burr?
Jackson.
That's right.
Jackson won that Battle of New Orleans,
Of course.
which actually was fought after the end of the war. But
I was blown away when I found out that he won, and then his wife dies when he wins the presidency. The wife dies immediately on the. It was horrible.
Yeah.
And I thought today's going back and forth in the news is probably was horrific then, because it was one newspaper and someone can write something awful about you.
Oh, yeah.
And it would just destroy you.
Well, dueling was an accepted practice at that time, and there were bad things said about what's her name, Rachel, I think. And I think Jackson had a duel over that. And, he had a fierce temper, and but if somebody said something about you or your wife, the normal practice in those days was to challenge you to a duel. You had to. If you didn't do that, it meant
It might
publicly
be true.
you accepted the charge.
That's right.
It would be true.
It would be true.
So therefore you had to challenge that.
And you could look for an apology while you're about to duel.
Well, it was a very regulated process, very formalized, that if there was a challenge, if I said, "How dare you say that? I challenge you to a duel," we each would then have to have seconds. The seconds were people, often lawyers. The seconds would get together to negotiate a deal. Is there a way you can apologize for what you said? Maybe you didn't really mean that. Maybe, fit of temper or so on. Maybe you meant something much more mild. Most duels were negotiated away. But, if you didn't have good negotiators or you had the bizarre thing in the Hamilton thing. I've read that over, and it's very clear that Hamilton would not budge a bit. You look at the letters that went back and forth, he's rather insulting toward Burr on, the response. So I don't think Burr wanted that duel at all, but he was sort of forced to do it. The pistols belonged to Hamilton, and there was a secret hair trigger on those pistols. Nobody knows if Burr was aware of that. Hamilton had to know it.
Yeah, what I got was it was a complete accident, meaning, yeah, I think Alexander wanted to take it to that point, but at the same time, I think he had a death wish. The way that Alexander was playing things, he always pushed everything to the limit.
Well, at that time, Hamilton was deeply in debt on land speculation, which kind of the stock market of the day. So his political career was really over, because Hamilton was not somebody who ran for office. He had been appointed.
Well, his daddy was gone, George Washington. Once George would protect him.
George appointed him to the major positions, whether Secretary of the Treasury or made him a general in the army. And Hamilton felt the country was really going in the wrong way. He had a much more aristocratic view of how things should be. People should elect their betters,
He had a British aristocracy point of view, and
right.
Jefferson had a French.
Right. So Jefferson had a much more devious view of things. So because I think he liked to portray himself as a great Democrat, but meanwhile he had his slaves, and he talked about the yeoman and the nobility of that. But this is a guy with who owned 800 human beings
And Burr did not have slaves, right?
Burr was against slavery.
Yeah.
So
I think Alexander did not have slaves either. He did not believe in that.
I think there were individual slaves in the Schuyler family. Hamilton, married very well. Very wealthy family, the Schuyler family. They owned portions of the Hudson River Valley. So Burr married the widow of a British officer. She was 10 years older than Burr. Now, he had lost his family by the time he was 3. His father was the Reverend Aaron Burr, who was the kind of founder and second president of Princeton. But Burr's mother, died probably of smallpox, something. His grandfather, Jonathan Edwards, the famous preacher and theologian and America's first intellectual, that was his grandfather, who took over Princeton and I think was president for a month and died of, once again, a fever. So at 3 years old, Burr was given to an uncle who was a Puritan minister who raised him. Burr was rebellious, ran away several times from the discipline and that. So, but he grew up very smart. He, I think, applied to Princeton at 13 or something. They turned him down, but he did go there, and along with James Madison and
all them guys.
He's the one, by the way, who introduced Dolly Madison to James Madison. He was living in the boarding house that Dolly Madison's mother ran when he got to know Dolly pretty well. So Burr got along with women quite well.
So in the Cincinnati club, did you meet other...
It's not a club, society.
The society. Yeah. Did you meet like any of the other guys, like George Washington's relative?
Oh yeah, John Washington, great guy. We visited.
Now the fascinating thing is most Washingtons are black now, so this would be probably the first Washington that's white, right?
Well, what you say is true. Yeah. Often the freed slaves took names from the families they were part of. So that happened, Jeffersons and Jacksons and Washingtons and so on. So, but John Washington, since George Washington had no direct descendants, John Washington was a nephew, many times removed because of the generations between. But group of us in the Society of the Cincinnati were in Washington, D.C., and John went with us on a tour of a house that George Washington owned that was still in the Washington's family. It was in West Virginia. You drive out of Washington along the Potomac, and the house has been preserved as it was at that time, including the paint and everything, so interior. So they built a supplementary place to it where the member of the family can go stay, whoever has it at the time. They sort of trade off, and question of who inherits it. So, but it was fascinating to go through that place and see what it was like originally.
So how are you doing? You good?
I'm good.
You got energy?
I think so. If you notice it's fading, I'm happy to...
I would love to finish it out with one last thing, because you've done great. When I was here with JR, you said, hey, try this, let's swab you and find out what's going on. That particular genealogy that you did, where it was the 5 women and the 5 men of the world, and then we ended up, JR and I ended up being from Gilgamesh.
Uh-huh.
Is there like a summary you can make up of that kind of genealogy? I still have the map, by the way. You gave me the map.
Oh, good.
You know how you were after that to find out the 3 matriarchs, the patriarchs,
mm-hmm.
and some part of you was Asian, from the Asian continent. Huh?
At some point.
At some point.
The 2 areas that genealogy covers broadly. One, of course, is the very traditional one, which is where you trace back through records. For every generation, every person, you need the birth date, the death date, the marriage date. And you need where were they born, the date they were born. So place and date, and you have to document that somehow. That can be a birth certificate, it can be the death certificate. If you go back far enough before states required the various certificates, then you have to get it from, sometimes there are court records, sometimes there are church records. You can get baptismal records and so on. So that's a very record-oriented process, and you get all your papers and documentation. Now, what's happened in recent decades has been the advent of DNA and being able to trace your ancestry through DNA, because as good as all those records may be, they may not be accurate. It could be that you were at some point adopted into a family and they didn't record it. Your DNA may not match the written record. Most of the time it does. But I think there's either 5 or 10% of if you test things with DNA where perhaps people had affairs and didn't manage, that didn't get revealed, but a new amount of DNA went into that particular family that didn't get recorded. So, but I got very interested in the DNA part too, because I've always been fascinated with the question of where did I come from, and what are the stories along the way? Who were the people? Who were the ancestors? And with DNA, you get it going way back. Genealogy, you stop. The written record only goes back so far. But with DNA, you can really say, oh, I see, I was among the original Celtic settlers of the British Isles. So that remains true. So my Irish background, I noticed with 23andMe that they can spot me as a heavy percentage, I think 50-some% Irish, and that they say the county my ancestors came from, which is County Mayo.
Did you do 23andMe?
Yeah, I've done 23andMe and Ancestry.
Do you recommend 23andMe better?
I think it's interesting to do both. I mean, I would do either one.
Did you get more detail on 23andMe?
You get different details. 23andMe gives you a lot of medical information, which that's interesting. Fortunately, I have no problems that way. So, and any results you're getting now are temporary because their methods keep getting better. They'll take the DNA they have and rework it, and they can be more specific. So,
and when you had me and JR do it, it was some British company.
Right. That was at the beginning of the whole thing.
How did they get a reference of those women and these men thousands of years ago?
Well, the Brian Sykes, who was the British scientist who had done a lot of work with populations, he was the one who wrote the book that dealt with the 7 daughters of Eve.
Right.
That all Europeans are descended from these 7 women.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it.
But that was the early stages. It's gotten more sophisticated now, I'm looking forward to what they'll come up with in the future.
And specifically, before we end, is there anything you can remember or talk about Gilgamesh and what you read about?
Not now. I mean, I was delighted when you got your information, because you learned so much.
It's incredible. So
you can look back at your background and see what things in the world brought you about. So that's what I find fascinating. It's like playing detective.
Yeah.
You can get the information, and genealogy in general is like that. I did a series called Ironside with Raymond Burr as a detective, and so
and his name is Burr.
I didn't know I was related to Burr at that point. I'd like to have questioned Ray to see what his genealogy was. So, playing detective is fun.
Yeah. So we're about to end. What do you have going on now? What would you like to be doing for the next 20, 30 years? Because with today, you don't know how long you're going to live. You can die tomorrow, you can live for another 20, 30 years. So what do you got set up and lined up?
I am very interested in several things. One of which, I'm very interested in my grandchildren, how they're doing their education and they're all, I think, doing terrifically. So I like that. I take a great interest in USC, in particular the cinema school there. Which, I'm chairman of the board of counselors, which I formed that group 28 years ago, and I think we've all done a lot of good for the school in the meantime. I like the overall thing of being on the board of a large university. We got a law school, a medical school, dental school, philosophy, literature. So there are many things that interest me, and so the meetings are fun. There are problems. We've had some problems recently, whether it's admissions or medical school things, but it keeps life interesting to have to handle those things. I also have helped with the Society of the Cincinnati, because most of us think the American Revolution needs to be better taught in America's schools. Mm-hmm. We have formed a new branch of that institution called the American Revolution Institute, mm-hmm. which is aimed at making sure the story gets told. I mean, what I think most Americans aren't aware of is what an incredible world event the American Revolution was. That for the first time, people said, we're not going to be governed by a king or an emperor. We're going to do it ourselves.
I have a great thing to tell people if they want to know and be educated. Don't tell the story from America's perspective, but go to Netflix and watch King Henry VIII. First watch the documentary on the 7th, then the 8th, and then let it ripple, and then you'll know why America went, we're done. But Henry VIII was a great, I mean, I did the whole season on it, and I know it's dramatized for TV, but I went, this is getting psycho. You know, you had the Pope trying to run everything, and then the king saying, no, I want my own religion. You're not going to run me. And then America finally goes, can we can we go west? You know, it's great if you start to learn really, it's like a Brexit. We did our own version of Brexit.
Well, what we did was send this message around the world because nobody thought this could be done. People don't govern themselves. You need a king or an emperor. Right? It won't work if you set up a government. Well, it's still working. And the messages that we sent out that we were not going to be subjects. We were going to be citizens of a country. That was new. Our Declaration of Independence, which said all men are created equal. Well, that was a beginning. That, you know, men at that time included, you know, if you used the word men, you were including all people. It could be interpreted that way. So that included women. It took a while for it to develop, but without that initial revolution, none of the other revolutions would have been happening. You know, other countries, what do? They may revolt, they set up a constitution. The French tried to do it. They didn't do it very well. They're on their 5th republic. We're on our 1st. So,
well, their first revolution created Napoleon, which then
created
south.
The bloodbath of the French Revolution, which ours didn't. The difference was we were used to governing ourselves. That when the people came here from Europe, and it was varied because it was Englishmen, it was Frenchmen, it was Swedes, Germans. Lots of Germans came. You know, our largest immigrant group is Germans, and all these people had to get along. You know, in Pennsylvania, you had the Scots, you had the Germans, you had the Quakers, and they had to work. How do we get along here? We all think different things, but they formed a legislature. They had a governor, and so therefore, by the time the revolution happened, all these states had basically been used to governing themselves because the king was thousands of miles away. If you sent a message to the Parliament, what should we do? Well, that would take months, and then the return message would take months. So people had to make the decisions on their own here. And that's why when the British decided to assert their authority around 1700s, people said, hey, wait a minute. We've governed ourselves. We don't need your interference here. What do you mean these taxes? We'll decide what taxes we ought to pay.
Well, good luck on that. I mean, I'm glad that I like education on that and the Civil War, and that the sensitivity on it's getting too people are getting so sensitive that we're rewriting history to please the sensitive rather than just have history what it is.
There's a bad movement that started, really in the 60s to tell American history as this terrible story of genocide and racism and sexism and all that. A guy named Howard Zinn wrote a book called The People's History of the United States. It's bad history. It's political propaganda. It's like if I were focusing on a human being, all I would do is look at their flaws. I look at any thing that was bad. We'll focus on all the warts. We won't tell how beautiful the girl is. We'll just focus on the fact she's got a couple of warts. So, and that has permeated our educational institution, and people are not being taught what an incredibly important world event the American Revolution was and what the principles were. It stood for the equality of people, and it stood for, we've got something here, let's keep improving it. And that's what we've done. You know, we had, if you look at it, what other country had actually fought a war to eliminate slavery? 600,000, mostly white men, died to get rid of slavery in this country. So that was a commitment to say, we're going to, you know, we're not going to let this exist. Even though it was buried into our system by, you know, Britain. They controlled the slave trade. It was a royal trade. So, and then people who grew up in the institution, it was hard for them to get rid of it. So the rest of the country had to go to war with them and say, you're done. That's it. So I think that's a noble story that needs to be told.
Well, thank you. Is there anything else you want to tell the people of YouTube, because that's where this is going?
Yeah.
And is there anything you want to say? You can say.
I've probably said enough.
Well, thank you very much, Frank, for going around the world with me on this. It's an honor and it's a pleasure, and well, thank you.
Been my pleasure. Thank you.